My next guest is truly what?
First guest.
What did I say?
Next guest.
And you corrected me in front of millions of people, didn't you?
If you think The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson was always smooth, classy, and full of laughter, think again. Behind that iconic desk, Johnny dealt with some guests who didn't just bring stories. They brought attitude. From stars who acted like they owned the stage, to celebrities who tried to outsmart, outshine, or outright irritate him, these moments turned late-night TV into a battlefield of egos. So from the guests who talked down to him, to the ones who came in with enough arrogance to fill the entire studio, here are the 7 most arrogant guests Johnny Carson ever had. 1. Bob Hope.
I was listening with your wife back there. You know, she's so amazed. She didn't know that. She said she prepares your clothes and you only have one.
Bob Hope was an absolute legend, a comedy icon who entertained troops overseas, starred in classic films, and became one of the most recognizable faces in American entertainment. But by the time he was making regular appearances on The Tonight Show, his relationship with Johnny Carson had become strained. And it wasn't because Hope had lost his talent. It was because he refused to adapt or show any flexibility. Hope insisted on doing everything his way. He came prepared with pre-written jokes and expected Johnny to act as his straight man, feeding him setups without any deviation from the script. That's not how Carson worked. Johnny thrived on spontaneity, quick reactions, and genuine conversation. He wanted his show to feel alive and unpredictable. But Hope treated every appearance like a scripted vaudeville routine from the 1940s. As Hope got older, his timing started to slip. The jokes didn't land like they used to, but instead of adjusting or going with the flow, he doubled down. He acted as though the show should revolve around him and that Johnny's job was simply to facilitate his performance. Carson found this incredibly frustrating. He respected Hope's legacy, but he didn't enjoy feeling like a prop in someone else's act. What made Hope's behavior especially grating was his complete lack of awareness. He genuinely seemed to believe that his approach was still working, that audiences were hanging on to his every word the way they had decades earlier. When jokes fell flat, Hope would plow forward as if nothing had happened. He never acknowledged the awkward silences or the forced laughter from the audience. In his mind, he was still the biggest star in the room, and everyone else needed to adjust to him. The backstage crew noticed it too. They'd see Hope arrive with his cue cards and his prepared material, refusing to engage with the writers or take suggestions. He'd go through the motions of a pre-interview, but wouldn't really listen. He had his routine, and that was that. The staff found him difficult to work with, and word got back to Johnny. It wasn't just Carson who found Hope exhausting. It was everyone involved in making the show work. Carson rarely spoke badly about other performers, but he made an exception for Hope. In private conversations and later interviews, Johnny admitted that he dreaded Hope's appearances. He felt that Hope had become too rigid, too controlling, and too self-centered. Hope seemed to believe that his status as a legend meant he didn't have to play by anyone else's rules, not even on someone else's show. The irony is that Hope probably didn't even realize how he was coming across. He was from a different era of show business, one where stars had more control and less collaboration, but on The Tonight Show, that attitude felt arrogant. It felt like Hope saw Johnny as beneath him, just another talk show host who should be grateful to have a legend sitting on his couch. And Carson, who had earned his own legendary status, didn't appreciate being treated that way. 2. Chevy Chase.
I wanted to get alone, little doggy, and write my own thing,
Right.
and get married, and thank you very much.
Chevy Chase walked into The Tonight Show during the peak of his fame. He was the breakout star of the original Saturday Night Live cast, known for his physical comedy and his cocky, self-assured persona. That persona worked great in sketches, but when he brought it to Johnny's couch, it didn't go over so well. From the moment Chevy sat down, he acted like he was the funniest person in the room. He constantly interrupted Johnny, talked over him, and tried to out-joke him at every turn. It was like he couldn't help himself. He saw an opportunity to be funny, and he took it, even if it meant stepping on Carson's toes. And that was a big mistake. Johnny Carson didn't tolerate guests who tried to hijack his show. He was the host. He controlled the pace, the tone, and the flow of the conversation. When a guest tried to take over, Johnny had ways of shutting them down. Sometimes with a sharp comeback, sometimes with silence, and sometimes with a look that said everything. Chevy didn't seem to pick up on any of those signals. Chase came off as someone who genuinely believed he was the star of the show, not just a guest on it. He leaned back in his chair with that trademark smirk, delivered his lines with complete confidence, and expected everyone to laugh. Sometimes they did, but other times the audience could sense the tension. They could feel that Johnny wasn't enjoying himself, and that made the whole segment uncomfortable. What made Chevy's arrogance worse was that it felt playful on the surface. He wasn't outright rude. He was just too competitive, too eager to prove he belonged in Johnny's league. But that competitive energy came across as disrespectful. It suggested that Chevy didn't understand the unspoken rules of being a guest. You're there to support the host, not compete with him. The problem with Chase was that his ego had grown faster than his wisdom. He was riding high on SNL success and hadn't yet learned the humility that comes with longevity in show business. He treated every appearance like an audition to prove he was just as talented as Carson, maybe even more so. That kind of energy doesn't play well with someone who's already proven everything there is to prove. Years later, stories emerged about how Carson really felt about Chase. Ed McMahon, Johnny's longtime sidekick, mentioned in interviews that Johnny found Chevy exhausting and self-absorbed. Other staff members recalled Johnny saying things like, "I don't need someone trying to be the host on my own show." The message was clear. Chevy had crossed a line, and Johnny remembered it. Carson never publicly trashed Chevy Chase, but people who worked on the show noticed. Johnny didn't invite Chevy back very often after those early appearances. And when asked about difficult guests in later years, Chevy's name came up more than once. He was talented, sure, but his arrogance made him hard to work with, and Johnny didn't have time for that. 3. William Frank Buckley, Jr.
So he was called in by the dean, because in those days, deans called in people who were refractory.
William Frank Buckley, Jr. was one of the most intelligent and articulate people to ever sit on The Tonight Show. He was a conservative political commentator, author, and television host known for his sharp mind and his even sharper tongue. But intelligence and charm don't always make for a good guest. Sometimes they make for an arrogant one. Buckley had a way of speaking that made you feel like you were being talked down to. He used big words, complex sentences, and a tone that suggested he was doing you a favor by explaining things. On his own show, Firing Line, that style worked. He was the host, and his intellectual superiority was part of the appeal, but on Johnny's couch, it felt condescending. When Johnny asked him questions, Buckley often responded with long, lecture-like answers. He didn't banter, he didn't joke, he didn't play along with the light conversational tone that made The Tonight Show so popular. Instead, he treated the interview like a debate class where he was the professor and everyone else was the student. Sometimes his answers came with a hint of sarcasm, as though he found the questions beneath him. He'd pause, raise an eyebrow, and deliver a response that was technically polite but dripping with superiority. It was the verbal equivalent of patting someone on the head and saying, "That's a cute question, but let me explain how things really work." Buckley also had this habit of correcting Johnny on minor details as if he couldn't help himself. If Johnny misstated a date or got a small fact wrong, Buckley would jump in with a correction, often delivered with a little smirk. It wasn't just about being accurate, it was about showing everyone that he knew more. And that kind of behavior gets old fast, especially when you're the host trying to keep things moving. Carson was no dummy. He was well-read, informed, and capable of holding his own in serious conversations. But he also knew his audience. He knew that most people tuning in at 11:30 at night didn't want a political science lecture. They wanted to be entertained. Buckley either didn't understand that or didn't care. He was going to speak the way he always spoke. And if people didn't get it, that was their problem. Johnny handled Buckley with professionalism, but you could see the frustration. He'd try to steer the conversation towards something lighter, and Buckley would steer it right back to policy or philosophy. It wasn't a conversation, it was a performance. And Buckley was the only performer on stage. 4. Dick Cavett.
You remember that thing Groucho said about the other fellow, Leonard Lyons? So the only way to get him to print a joke right is to tell it to him wrong.
Dick Cavett and Johnny Carson had a complicated relationship. On the surface, they were colleagues and even friends. But beneath that, there was a quiet rivalry. Cavett hosted his own talk show and positioned himself as the more intellectual, highbrow alternative to Carson's populist approach. When Cavett appeared on The Tonight Show, that dynamic sometimes came through in ways that felt a little too smug. Cavett had a way of discussing cultural and intellectual topics that made it seem like he was the more refined, thoughtful host. He'd talk about books Johnny hadn't read, reference plays Johnny hadn't seen, and drop names of philosophers and artists in a way that felt less like conversation and more like one-upmanship. It was subtle, but it was there. Johnny preferred relaxed, humorous exchanges. He liked guests who could laugh at themselves and go with the flow. Cavett, on the other hand, sometimes seemed more interested in proving how smart he was. He'd answer questions with a little too much detail, or he'd correct Johnny on a minor point, or he'd launch into an anecdote that showed off his connections to the literary and artistic world. There were moments when Cavett's tone crossed the line from confident to condescending. He'd say something that could be interpreted as a gentle dig at Johnny or at the format of the show. He'd imply that his own show was more serious, more meaningful, more worthy of attention. And Johnny, who was fiercely proud of what he'd built, didn't appreciate that. The tension between them was rooted in different philosophies about what late-night television should be. Cavett believed talk shows could be a platform for serious intellectual discourse. Carson believed they should be entertaining first and educational second. Neither was wrong, but their approaches clashed. And when Cavett sat on Johnny's couch, acting like his way was superior, it felt like a direct challenge to everything Carson had built. What really got under Johnny's skin was the way Cavett would subtly compare their ratings and audiences. He'd make offhand comments about how his viewers appreciated substance or how he wasn't afraid to tackle difficult subjects. The implication was clear. Cavett saw himself as the thinking person's host, while Johnny was just the popular guy. That kind of elitism didn't sit well with Carson, who knew his show succeeded because it connected with real people. Carson rarely showed his annoyance on camera, but people close to him knew. He found Cavett's subtle superiority irritating. It felt like Cavett was trying to position himself above Johnny, as though being the host of a less popular but more respectable show made him more important. And that attitude didn't sit well with the king of late night. 5. Truman Capote.
All right.
Skip rope meditation.
All right, you gonna do a couple of steps? Come on, Truman.
Truman Capote was a literary genius and a fascinating personality. He wrote, In Cold Blood and Breakfast at Tiffany's, two of the most important works of the 20th century. But he was also unpredictable, theatrical, and sometimes cruel. When he appeared on The Tonight Show, you never knew which version of Capote you were going to get. Capote had a sharp tongue. He loved gossip, loved stirring up drama, and loved making sly, cutting remarks about people in his world. On Johnny's show, he often appeared amused by everything around him, but not in a kind way. It was more like he found the whole experience beneath him, like he was tolerating the interview rather than enjoying it. He would give vague, evasive answers when Johnny asked about his work. He would deflect with a joke or a sarcastic comment. And sometimes he would say something outright dismissive, as though the question wasn't worth his time. It came across as arrogant, like Capote thought he was too important, too brilliant, too interesting to engage in normal conversation. What made Capote's arrogance more frustrating was that he could be charming when he wanted to be. He had stories that captivated audiences. He had wit and humor and a unique way of looking at the world. But he chose when to share that side of himself. And when he didn't feel like it, he made sure everyone knew. Capote also had this habit of name-dropping constantly. He would mention famous friends, exclusive parties, and elite social circles as if to remind everyone that he moved in a world they couldn't access. It wasn't just conversation. It was a flex. He wanted people to know he was connected, important, and part of something special. And that got tiresome fast. Johnny handled Capote carefully. He respected the man's talent and knew that audiences were fascinated by him. But there were moments when you could see Carson's patience wearing thin. Capote would make a particularly cutting remark, and Johnny would pause, smile tightly, and move on to the next question. He didn't push back, but he didn't laugh either. Capote's appearances were always memorable, but not always for the right reasons. He brought drama and unpredictability to the show, which was great television. But he also brought an air of superiority that made him hard to like. He acted as though everyone else was playing a game, and he was the only one who understood the rules. 6. Joan Rivers.
She is healthy. She's healthy.
Healthy. It's just, she has to iron her blouse on my chest. That's how.
Joan Rivers and Johnny Carson had one of the most complicated relationships in late-night television history. Early in her career, Joan was one of Johnny's favorite guests. She was funny, fearless, and quick on her feet. Johnny championed her, gave her opportunities, and even let her guest host The Tonight Show more than any other comedian. But things changed. As Joan became more successful, her comedic style became sharper and more abrasive. She pushed boundaries, made edgy jokes, and sometimes aimed her humor directly at Johnny himself. What started as playful teasing began to feel more like challenges. She wasn't just a guest anymore. She was a comedian who saw herself as Johnny's equal. The real turning point came when Joan accepted her own late-night talk show without telling Johnny. She signed the deal with Fox and became direct competition for The Tonight Show. Johnny felt betrayed. He believed Joan owed him loyalty after everything he'd done for her career. He expected her to at least give him a heads up before going head-to-head with him in the same time slot. Joan saw it differently. She believed she had earned the opportunity and didn't need Johnny's permission to advance her career. But the way she handled it, keeping it secret, making the announcement publicly, felt like a slap in the face to Carson. And he never forgave her. What made the situation worse was that Joan had assured Johnny multiple times that she wasn't interested in hosting her own show. She had told him she was happy being his go-to guest host and wasn't looking to compete. Then suddenly, the announcement came. Johnny felt lied to. It wasn't just about business, it was personal. He'd trusted her, and she'd broken that trust. After that, Johnny refused to speak to Joan. He cut her off completely. When her show failed and she wanted to come back to The Tonight Show, Johnny made sure she never did. He held that grudge for the rest of his life. Joan tried to reach out, tried to apologize, tried to explain, but Johnny wouldn't budge. Looking back, many people saw Joan's decision as arrogant. She believed she could succeed without Johnny, and maybe she could have. But the way she went about it showed a lack of respect for the man who had lifted her up. And in Hollywood, loyalty matters. Joan's arrogance cost her the most important relationship of her career. She spoke about it publicly for years, always with regret, always wishing she'd handled things differently. But by then, it was too late. 7. Don Rickles.
I know you.
Yeah.
When you're on 26 years, I mean, where's the challenge?
Gives you a charge.
Yeah, but what do you need to charge? 26 years. Walk away. It's over.
Yeah.
Don Rickles was the king of insult comedy. His entire act was built on roasting people, tearing them down with jokes, and making audiences laugh at someone else's expense. And nobody was safe. Not celebrities, not audience members, and definitely not Johnny Carson. Whenever Rickles appeared on The Tonight Show, he went after Johnny hard. He made jokes about Johnny's personal life, his appearance, his career, and anything else he could think of. Most of the time, Johnny played along. He laughed, fired back, and treated it like the comedy it was meant to be. But there were moments when Rickles crossed the line. Rickles had a fearless, bulldozing style. He didn't read the room. He didn't ease up when things got uncomfortable. He just kept going, kept pushing, kept roasting. And sometimes his jokes felt less like humor and more like genuine disrespect. He would interrupt Johnny, talk over him, and hijack the conversation completely. What made Rickles different from other arrogant guests was that his behavior was part of his act. He wasn't trying to show off or prove he was smarter than Johnny. He was just doing what he always did, being Don Rickles. But that didn't make it any less difficult for Johnny to deal with. The thing about Rickles was that he never turned it off. Even during commercial breaks, he'd keep going, making jokes at Johnny's expense while the cameras weren't rolling. The crew would laugh, but you could tell Johnny was working hard to maintain his composure. Carson usually tried to keep the peace. He would laugh off the insults, redirect the conversation, and remind the audience that it was all in good fun. But if you watched closely, you could see moments where Johnny's smile didn't quite reach his eyes. You could see him working hard to stay in control while Rickles took over his show. Johnny Carson handled arrogant guests with grace, humor, and professionalism, but he never forgot who really ran the show.